Get close to a moai, closer than the tourists ever do. Stand right at its base, where the grass meets the stone, and look up. The first thing you'll notice isn't the size. It isn't the weight or the age, or the fact that someone carved this from a volcano wall with nothing but handheld rock picks. The first thing you notice is the face. And the face has no eyes. Two hollow sockets open to the sky where rain collects and moss grows. For centuries, everyone who came to this island, explorers, missionaries, archaeologists, assumed the same thing. That's how they were always meant to look. Blind giants staring at nothing. Then, in 1979, an archaeologist named Sergio Rapu Haoa was working at the base of a fallen statue. He was local, born on the island, Rapanui by blood. And in the rubble around the platform, he found something that nobody had paid attention to before. Pieces of white coral, broken and scattered in the dirt. Some of the pieces were curved, and a few of them had a recognizable shape. He collected the fragments and fitted them together. What he was holding, he realized, was an eye. A carved disc of white coral with a pupil of black obsidian, volcanic glass. The moai had eyes, whole separate objects shaped to fit into the sockets and be taken out again. When the eyes went in, the statue woke up. That's how the Rapanui describe it. The figure became a living face, a ringa aura. It could see, and through its gaze, a force called mana flowed outward, toward the village, toward the people. Somebody took those eyes out and smashed them. The coral shards Rapu Haoa found at the base weren't accidental breakage. They were the remains of deliberate destruction. Whoever did this didn't just knock the statues down, they blinded them first. Why? We'll come back to that, but step back for a moment and take in the scale of what's sitting on this island. Roughly 1,000 stone statues spread across 63 square miles of volcanic rock in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. A few still stand, but most have fallen. The average moai is about 13 feet tall and weighs somewhere between 12 and 14 tons, heavier than a loaded cement truck. And many of them are far bigger than average. The tallest statue ever raised onto a platform is called Paro. Paro stands nearly 33 feet high. It weighs about 75 tons. Try to picture that. Take a double-decker bus, stand it on its end, then keep loading weight onto it until the whole thing weighs as much as a fighter jet. That's a single statue, and there were about 1,000 of them. And Paro isn't even the biggest one they attempted. In the quarry at Rano Raraku, the volcano crater where almost all the statues were born, there lies an unfinished giant. Researchers call it El Gigante. It's still attached to the rock, half carved, never separated from the mountain. 71 feet long and weighing up to 182 tons. If they'd ever stood it up, it would have been as tall as a 7-story building. They never finished carving it. And the question that haunts every archaeologist who's stood in that quarry is simple. Why even start? What were they trying to prove, and to whom? Here's another detail that takes a minute to land. Most of the moai were placed along the coastline on stone platforms that ring the island like a necklace. But they don't face the ocean, they face inland. Their backs are to the sea. They aren't watching for ships or guarding against enemies from across the water. They're watching the villages and the people who live in them. If you've ever been to the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History in Washington, on the National Mall, you might have walked past a moai near the Constitution Avenue entrance. It was collected in 1886 by the crew of the USS Mohican from a rare inland site called Ahu Ko Te Riku. It's one of only about 10 intact moai in museum collections anywhere in the world. And by Rapanui standards, it's small. The ones that lined the coast were 10 times heavier, 5 times taller. What you see in that museum lobby is a miniature. So here's the situation. A tiny island, as far from any continent as you can get on this planet, over 2,000 miles to the coast of Chile, which itself is roughly the distance from New York to Los Angeles. The people who lived there had no metal, no wheels, and no animals strong enough to pull a load. And yet they carved and transported nearly 1,000 stone figures, some weighing more than a full passenger airplane. How did they do it? That question has been asked for 300 years now, and only in the last 15 has a real answer started to come together. How the statues were carved, and how they were moved across miles of rough ground. The answer turns out to be stranger and more elegant than anybody guessed, because the islanders told us the truth all along, and nobody believed them. But there's a second question, and it cuts deeper. Why did they stop? What made them abandon the quarry and pull down the very statues they'd spent generations building? Because something did. Between the first European visit in 1722 and the second one, just 52 years later, this island changed. Statues that had been standing were now face down in the dirt. The people looked thin. Their boats were falling apart. Something broke. And the people who could have told us exactly what happened, most of them were taken away on ships and never came back. Before we get to any of that, though, we need to start with the witnesses. A handful of outsiders who actually saw this island with their own eyes, wrote down what they found, and left us with the only records we have. And the gaps between their accounts are where the real mystery lives. The 5th of April, 1722, Easter Sunday. 3 Dutch ships are sailing the southern Pacific, sent by the Dutch West India Company to find a continent that doesn't exist. Terra Australis, the great southern land that mapmakers had been drawing for centuries. The commander is Jacob Roggeveen, a 62-year-old lawyer and former colonial judge who'd spent most of his career behind a desk. This is his one big voyage. And on Easter morning, his lookout spots land. A small island, alone in an ocean that stretches nearly 7,000 miles from coast to coast. Roggeveen names it for the holiday. That name will stick for 300 years. He sends men ashore. They stay only a few days. And what Roggeveen writes in his logbook is the beginning of everything we know about this place from outside. He describes tall stone figures, some of them, by his estimate, no less than 30 feet high. He notes that he can't understand how any people could have raised them without thick ropes or heavy timber, because the island has neither. The ground is barren. There are no tall trees. The figures stand along the coast, and they are enormous. But Roggeveen isn't an archaeologist. He's not even particularly curious about the statues. He's looking for a continent, and this isn't one. His ships take on water, his men trade briefly with the islanders, and by the next morning they sail on. His notes are the first outside record of the island, and they're only a few pages long. A snapshot, the first frame of a story that nobody will return to finish for another 50 years. When someone finally does come back, the picture has changed. Captain James Cook arrives in March of 1774. Cook is a different kind of visitor. Where Roggeveen was a bureaucrat on an errand, Cook is one of the finest navigators and record keepers of the 18th century. He carries artists who sketch what they see. His journal entries are careful and specific about distances and numbers. And what Cook sees on Rapanui doesn't match what Roggeveen described. Many of the statues are lying face down on the ground, thrown from their platforms. The stone slabs that once held them up are cracked. Cook's men examine the fallen figures and note that the necks have snapped on impact, the weakest point. This wasn't erosion or earthquake. These statues were pushed over. The islanders themselves show signs of hunger. Cook describes their canoes as sad little things, patched together from short planks and scraps of driftwood, barely able to hold 2 or 3 people. For an island surrounded by ocean, the Rapanui have almost no way to fish. And Cook, careful observer that he is, can see that this doesn't make sense. You don't build 1,000-ton monuments and then lose the ability to build a decent boat. Something happened here, something big, and it happened fast enough that a single human lifetime fits between the before and the after. Cook records what he sees, but he has no explanation. We still don't have a complete one. And here we run into a problem that hangs over everything else we're about to discuss. The outside records of this island are painfully thin.
Until the late 1800s, no European stayed longer than a few days. The handful of missionaries who eventually settled on Rapanui in the 1860s did describe daily life in some detail: what people ate, how they dressed and worshipped. But those same missionaries also collected the island's wooden tablets, carved with rows of mysterious symbols, a script the islanders called Rongorongo, and they burned them. They called the tablets pagan objects. They fed them into the fire. Try to take that in. The physical evidence of what may be one of the rarest achievements in human history was used as kindling by men who came to save souls. Only about 27 objects with Rongorongo inscriptions survive today. They're scattered across museums in Santiago, London, Vienna, Washington. Not a single piece remains on the island where they were made. Nobody alive can read them. And the debate over what they even are has gone on for more than a century. Is it true writing, where each symbol stands for a sound or a word? Or is it something else? A system of memory aids for rituals, a kind of sacred notation that only makes sense if you already know the chant. Then, in 2024, something shifted. A team led by Silvia Ferrara in Bologna took tiny samples from surviving Rongorongo tablets and radiocarbon dated the wood. The result? One tablet was made from a tree cut down roughly between 1493 and 1509. That's before any European ship came anywhere near the island. If the inscription was carved when the wood was fresh, then Rongorongo is genuinely pre-contact. And that would place Rapanui alongside Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, and Mesoamerica as one of the only places on Earth where writing was born independently. For the linguists and anthropologists working on this problem, many of them at American universities, cracking Rongorongo would rank with the decipherment of Linear B, an ancient script from Greece that nobody could read for centuries. But the chain is broken. The Peruvian slave raids of 1862 carried off roughly 1,500 Rapanui, about a third of the island's entire population at the time. The raiders took them to work the guano fields, that is, mines of dried bird droppings used as fertilizer in Peru. After international protests, the survivors were allowed to return. Of the 1,500 taken, 15 came back. They brought smallpox with them. By 1877, the island's population had fallen to 111 people. 111 out of what had been several thousand. The men and women who knew how to read Rongorongo, who held the genealogies and the chants in their memory, who could have explained why the statues were pulled down and what the carvings on those tablets actually said, they were gone. What we have left is fragments, partial records from a few European visitors, a couple of dozen inscribed objects that nobody can read, and oral traditions collected from survivors by researchers who arrived decades after the catastrophe. Every conclusion we draw about this island sits on that foundation. Keep that in mind as we go. Now, there's one more figure we need to talk about before we leave the question of sources. His name is Thor Heyerdahl, and he may be one of the most famous and most wrong explorers of the 20th century. In 1947, Heyerdahl sailed a balsa wood raft called the Kon-Tiki from Peru to the Tuamotu Islands, a distance of about 4,300 miles across the open Pacific. His goal was to prove that ancient South Americans could have settled Polynesia. The voyage made him world famous. He followed it up by spending a year on Easter Island in the mid-1950s, running excavations and conducting experiments. He wrote a best-selling book called Aku Aku. He compared the stonework of the island's platforms to Inca walls in Peru. He noted the presence of South American plants, including the sweet potato, which had clearly reached Polynesia before any European contact. His theory was bold and simple. The people who built the Moai came from the east, from South America, carried by the currents. And for decades, the public believed him. Heyerdahl was a brilliant storyteller, a handsome adventurer, and he had a knack for making ancient history feel alive. The problem is that he was wrong. When geneticists finally tested Rapanui DNA, the answer was clear: Polynesian all the way through. The language, the fish hooks, the way they farmed, it all pointed the same direction. The Kon-Tiki proved that a raft could drift from Peru to the Central Pacific. It didn't prove that anyone ever actually made that particular crossing to settle Rapanui. Heyerdahl lost the scientific argument decades ago, and today no serious researcher supports the South American origin theory. And yet, Heyerdahl matters. Before him, hardly anyone outside academia had heard of Easter Island. After him, everyone had. He brought cameras and film crews. He wrote books that sold millions of copies. He made the world care about a dot of rock in the middle of the ocean. And that attention eventually drew the real scientists who did the careful, quiet work that overturned his theories. Heyerdahl was wrong about where the islanders came from, but without him, we might never have found out at all. So we know who described the island and how much of the record has been lost. What we haven't answered yet is the most basic question of all. Who were these people? Where did they come from, sailing across thousands of miles of open water with no instruments and no maps? And what did they find when they finally reached shore? Imagine you're standing on the deck of a catamaran. It's a double-hulled canoe, maybe 60 feet long, built from planks lashed together with braided cord. Below your feet, in the space between the two hulls, there are baskets of dried fish, gourds of fresh water, bundles of taro root, cuttings of sweet potato wrapped in damp bark, a few live chickens in a cage. Your wife is sitting with the children near the stern. Your brother is watching the stars. The nearest land is 1,200 miles behind you. The nearest land ahead, you don't actually know. You're sailing east into the sunrise because someone told you there was an island out there and you believed them. You have no compass and no charts. You're reading the ocean the way a farmer reads soil, the direction of the swells and the color of the water, which birds fly overhead and where they go at dusk. When the clouds cover the stars, you feel the current against the hull and hold your course by the rhythm of the waves. This sounds like a survival story. For Polynesian navigators, it was routine. Over about 2,000 years, these sailors settled every habitable island in the Pacific, from Hawaii in the north to New Zealand in the south, a triangle of ocean covering an area larger than all of Europe, Africa, and Asia combined. They did it without any of the instruments that European sailors would consider essential for centuries to come. And the voyage to Rapanui, the most remote island they ever reached, was the last and longest leg of that expansion. According to Rapanui oral tradition, the man who led that voyage was a chief named Hotu Matua. He sailed from a place called Hiva, heading east into the sunrise. And here is the detail that changes everything about how we understand this journey. He didn't stumble onto the island by accident. According to the tradition, his brother, or in some versions, his scout, was already there, waiting for him. The island had been found first, and then the settlement party followed. The voyage was planned from the start, down to the advance scout. So where was Hiva? Several islands in the Marquesas chain in the Central Pacific carry the word Hiva in their names. Nuku Hiva, Hiva Oa, Fatu Hiva. The distance from the Marquesas to Rapanui is roughly 2,200 miles. That's a long way. But for people who had already crossed comparable distances to reach Hawaii and New Zealand, to settle every scrap of land across 10 million square miles of open ocean, 2,200 miles was a problem with a known solution. Radiocarbon dating of the earliest settlement layers on the island points to arrival somewhere between 1200 and 1300 AD. That is, roughly 7 or 8 centuries ago. The settlers brought with them everything they would need to start a new life. Chickens, rats, banana plants, sugar cane, and the all-important sweet potato, which they called kumara. The Polynesian Voyaging Society proved that these methods still work. In 2017, a Hawaiian double-hulled canoe called Hokulea completed a voyage around the entire world using only traditional wayfinding, reading the stars and the swells, watching the birds. No instruments at all.
The same tradition that carried Hotu Matua's people to a speck of rock in the largest ocean on Earth also carried people to Hawaii, the 50th American state. The techniques are real, and they have been tested, and they are old enough that by the time Europeans were still hugging their coastlines, afraid to lose sight of land, Polynesian navigators had already mapped the Pacific by memory. Remember Heyerdahl's claim that the settlers came from South America? The DNA evidence settled that question. The Rapanui are Polynesian, full stop. But the story doesn't end quite so cleanly. When scientists looked more closely at Rapanui genomes, they found a small trace of South American ancestry, about 6%. It may have arrived after the initial settlement, through later contact, or even after European ships began crossing the Pacific. Nobody knows for certain. And then there's the sweet potato. Kumara is a South American plant. It reached Polynesia well before Columbus, well before any documented European contact with the Pacific. How? Did Polynesian sailors reach the coast of South America and bring the plant home? Or did South Americans carry it west by raft or by accident? This is one of those questions where the honest answer is, we don't know. The sweet potato crossed the ocean, and it did so before anyone we can name made the trip. The method of its arrival is still a genuine mystery. What we do know is what Hotu Matua's people found when they arrived. The island they reached was nothing like the barren rock that Roggeveen would see 8 centuries later. Pollen samples taken from the sediment at the bottom of the island's crater lakes tell a clear story. Rapanui was once covered in forest. Tall palms, dense enough to block the wind, thick enough to shade the ground. The volcanic soil was rich. There were no predators, no dangerous animals of any kind. For a group of settlers arriving by canoe, it must have looked like a gift. With one catch. The island had no rivers, no streams, nothing that could be called a flowing source of fresh water on the surface. All of the fresh water on Rapanui comes from rain that soaks into the porous volcanic rock and seeps out slowly, mostly along the coastline where the rock meets the sea. The only open fresh water sat in the crater lakes at the top of the island's 3 extinct volcanoes. Everything else had to be collected or dug for. On an island of 63 square miles, water was the one resource that couldn't be taken for granted, and that single constraint would shape where people lived and where they built, and eventually where they placed their statues. So the settlers arrived in a forested paradise with a hidden problem. They cleared land for farming. They used timber for canoes and cooking fires, for building houses. And they brought with them, probably without meaning to, the Polynesian rat. Small, quick, and hungry, these rats did something that no amount of logging could do on its own. They ate the palm seeds. A cut tree can regrow if its seeds survive, but when rats eat every seed before it can sprout, the forest doesn't come back. Logging and rat damage worked together over centuries, and the result was total. By the time the first European ships arrived, the island was bare. The dense palm forest that had greeted the first settlers was gone, replaced by grass and scrub. Without tall trees, the Rapanui couldn't build proper ocean-going canoes. Without canoes, they couldn't fish in deep water. The protein in their diet shrank. They turned to farming and chickens,
to whatever they could grow in the volcanic soil. But the ocean, which had brought them here, was now closed to them. They were stuck on a small island, getting smaller in every way that mattered with each generation. And yet, while the forest was vanishing and the canoes were shrinking to scraps, the Rapanui didn't stop building. They kept carving statues. In fact, they carved more and bigger ones, as if the answer to a shrinking world was to make the monuments larger. The question is how? Because we're not talking about one sculptor with a chisel. We're talking about a system, a kind of factory built into the wall of a volcano. If you're enjoying this story so far, I'd really appreciate it if you hit the like button. It helps more people find this kind of content. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's a good time. There's plenty more to come. Quick question for you. The Polynesian navigators crossed over 2,000 miles of open ocean with no compass and no charts, reading the stars and the waves. If you had to cross an ocean in a wooden canoe, would you trust the stars or would you turn back? Let me know in the comments. Rano Raraku is a volcanic crater on the eastern side of the island, and from a distance it looks like any other grass-covered hill. But walk closer and the hillside starts to look wrong. Shapes push through the soil. A nose here, the ridge of a brow half buried in earth there. The ground is full of statues. Some are upright, sunk into the slope up to their chests. Others lie on their backs, staring at the sky, still attached to the bedrock underneath them. This is the quarry, the place where nearly every Moai on the island was born. 95% of all the statues on Rapanui came from this one spot. The rock here is volcanic tuff, that is, compressed volcanic ash. It's softer than the basalt, the hard, dark volcanic rock found elsewhere on the island, soft enough to carve with hand tools, but it's still stone. You can't scratch it with your fingernail. You need something harder to cut it, and the carvers had exactly one option: basalt. They shaped pieces of basalt into pointed hand picks about the size of a fist, and they called them toki. At the base of the quarry, archaeologists have found thousands upon thousands of these toki, most of them broken, worn to stubs, discarded. Imagine a parking lot covered in shattered hammers. That's what the ground around Rano Raraku looks like. The sheer number of broken tools tells you how many hours of labor went into each statue and how many statues were being worked on at any given time. The carving itself was done in a way that seems, at first, almost backwards. The sculptors didn't cut a rough block from the cliff and then shape it on the ground. They carved the statue in place, right into the hillside, with the figure lying on its back. They started with the face. They carved the nose, the brow, the thin compressed lips, the elongated ears. Then the hands, folded across the belly. Then the sides. All of this fine detail was finished while the statue was still attached to the mountain behind it, connected along its back like an unborn child to a wall of rock. Only after the entire front was complete did the carvers begin the most dangerous step. They undercut the back, chipping away at the keel that held the statue to the cliff until the whole figure was resting on a thin spine of stone. Then they broke that spine and slid the statue down the slope on rubble and packed earth, ready for transport. Think about what this means. You're lying on your back inside a narrow trench cut into a hillside, and you're carving upward above your head with a handheld rock pick. Stone dust is falling into your face. The ceiling is the belly of a 15-ton ancestor. One mistake with the keel and the whole thing cracks. And you are doing this with a tool that fits in your palm. Why work this way? It would have been far simpler to cut a raw block, drag it to flat ground, and carve it in the open. Plenty of room and light, no risk of the figure cracking before it was finished. But the Rapanui didn't do it that way. Something about the process mattered as much as the result. The statue had to emerge from the mountain whole, complete, its face already formed before it left the rock.
As if the carving wasn't making a statue, but revealing one, the way you might peel bark from a branch to show the white wood underneath. The mountain held the ancestor inside it, and the sculptor's job was to set it free. And these weren't individual works of art, each one different. Laser scanning of surviving Moai has shown that the faces share near-perfect bilateral symmetry. That is, the left half mirrors the right half almost exactly. The same thin nose and compressed lips, the same heavy brow and long ears appear on statue after statue in the same proportions over and over. Every face follows the same design. A production standard, repeated with a precision that suggests the carvers were working from templates. Perhaps wooden measuring sticks, perhaps reference carvings cut into the quarry wall itself. We haven't found those templates, but the uniformity of the statues is hard to explain without them. And the scale of production is staggering. 397 unfinished statues remain in the quarry today, frozen at every stage of the process. Some are barely outlines, rough shapes scratched into the rock face, just enough to see where a figure will eventually emerge. Others are almost done, face and hands complete, the body polished smooth, still connected to the bedrock by nothing more than a narrow ridge along the back. One good day's work from being free. And then there are the ones that cracked, a fracture running through the nose, a flaw in the tuft that split the torso. These were abandoned in place, left where they lay, because a broken Moai was useless. You can't glue stone. You start again. Around these unfinished figures, scattered across the quarry floor, lie broken toki, coils of rope fiber, stone wedges. The whole site looks like a construction yard, abandoned in the middle of a shift, never wound down or cleaned up, just left where it stood. Whatever ended the work at Rano Raraku, it happened suddenly. And then there is El Gigante. We talked about it earlier. 71 feet long, the biggest statue anyone on this island ever attempted. It lies on its back in the upper quarry, still attached to the rock, maybe a third of the way through the carving. And the question that archaeologists keep coming back to is simple. Could they even have moved this thing? At somewhere between 160 and 182 tons, it would have been 4 or 5 times heavier than the biggest statue they ever successfully transported. Most scholars think the answer is no. The engineering required to move something that heavy across miles of hilly terrain without wheels would have been beyond anything the islanders had done before. So why start carving it at all? One possibility, the clans that built the Moai were competing with each other, and the competition kept pushing the statues bigger. Each generation wanted to outdo the last. Each new chief needed a statue taller than the neighbors, and El Gigante was the point where ambition ran past what was physically possible. A monument that could never leave the quarry, built to prove that your clan had the resources to try. Or maybe it was something else entirely.
Maybe the statue was never meant to be moved. Maybe it was sacred in the quarry itself, a figure so large that it belonged to the mountain. We don't know. And that honesty is worth something here, because the truth is, even with all the laser scans and all the archaeology, we don't understand the thinking of the people who carved these things. We understand the tools and the stone. The motive is still partly hidden from us. One thing is certain, though, carving a Moai, even a small one, was only half the job. The statue had to get from this quarry to the coast, a distance of anywhere from 6 to 11 miles, across hilly, uneven ground covered in grass and loose rock. And these people had no wheels and no draft animals of any kind. When later visitors asked the Rapanui how the statues were moved, the answer was always the same. They said the statues walked. The statues walked. That's what the Rapanui told every outsider who asked. The Moai got up and walked to the coast, guided by mana, by spiritual power. For a long time, researchers smiled politely and moved on. They assumed it was a myth, a poetic way of saying, "We forgot." And then, in stages, over about 70 years of experiments and arguments, science caught up with the legend. Let's start with the problem itself. You've carved a statue in the quarry at Rano Raraku. It weighs, depending on its size, anywhere from 12 to 80 tons. You need to get it to the coast, where its platform is waiting. That's a journey of up to 11 miles, over ground that rises and falls across volcanic hillsides. You have rope, made from the bark of the hau tree. You have people, and that's about it. In the later period, when most of the statues were being moved, there probably weren't enough large trees left for wooden rollers either. So what do? Dozens of theories have been proposed over the years. Wooden sledges pulled across logs, cradles rocked forward on rails, runners greased with sweet potato. Every idea has the same trouble. They all require large amounts of wood, and the island, by the time the statue building reached its peak, was running out of trees. The first person to test any of these ideas on the ground was Heyerdahl in 1955. He recruited 180 islanders to drag a 12-ton Moai across flat ground, lying face down on a wooden sledge. It worked, barely. The statue moved, but it was one of the smallest Moai, and even so, the effort was enormous. Scale that method up to Paro at 75 tons, and you'd need something like 1,000 people hauling in coordination, plus a road of timber stretching miles. The math didn't work. The trees didn't exist. Heyerdahl had proven you could drag a small statue the hard way, but he hadn't solved the bigger question. Then in 1986, a Czech engineer named Pavel had an idea that nobody else had seriously considered. What if the statues weren't dragged at all? What if they were moved upright? Look at a Moai from the side. The base isn't flat. It's curved, rounded, with a slight convex bulge. And the statue's center of gravity doesn't sit directly over the middle of the base. It leans forward just a few degrees. For decades, people had assumed these were imperfections in the carving. Pavel looked at them and saw something else, a design. You know how you move a heavy refrigerator across a kitchen floor when you can't lift it. You tilt it onto one edge, walk it forward, then tilt it onto the other edge and walk it forward again. Left, right, left, right. The refrigerator waddles across the room. Pavel proposed that the Rapanui did exactly this with their statues. The curved base and the forward lean were features built into the statue so it could rock from side to side and inch forward with each tilt. He ran small experiments in the Czech Republic and on the island itself. The results were promising. A statue really could be rocked forward in this way, using teams of people pulling ropes from either side. But the experiments were small in scale, and not many people took notice. The world wasn't ready to believe that multi-ton stone figures had waddled across the landscape like penguins. It took another 25 years for the proof to arrive. In 2012, the archaeologists Carl Lipo of Binghamton University in New York and Terry Hunt, then at the University of Hawaii, built a full-size replica Moai, 4 1/3 tons, with a D-shaped base and a forward lean of about 10 degrees. They attached 3 ropes. 2 teams of people stood on either side, rocking the statue left and right. A 3rd team held a rope behind the statue as a safety brake, keeping it from tipping forward too far. 18 people moved 330 feet in 40 minutes. The statue walked. It rocked side to side in a slow zigzag, inching forward with each tilt, looking for all the world like a stone giant taking steps. The footage spread everywhere. National Geographic ran a feature. PBS aired a Nova documentary. For American viewers, the image of a small team of people rocking a concrete moai down a dirt road became one of the most memorable archaeology experiments ever shown on television. But the real confirmation came later in the 2025 publication in the Journal of Archaeological Science. Lipo and Hunt analyzed 962 moai and found that the statues abandoned along the ancient roads, the ones that had fallen during transport, shared a specific set of proportions: a wide D-shaped base, a forward lean of 6 to 15 degrees. The road statues turned out to be purpose-built for vertical transport. Walkers. The road statues were shaped differently from the ones that had already been set onto platforms, because the platform statues had their bases recarved to sit flat after arrival. The road statues still had their walking geometry intact. And here is where the legend meets the physics. The Rapanui said the statues walked, moved by mana. Watch the footage of the experiment, and you can see why they said it. 18 people stand at a distance, pulling ropes. The statue itself seems to move on its own, swaying gently, stepping forward. The rope teams are far enough away that, to a bystander, the statue appears to be walking under its own power, guided by an invisible force. Myth and measurement, arriving at the same picture from opposite directions. Not every statue made it. 92 moai lie along the ancient roads between the quarry and the coast, fallen where they tipped. More than half of them went down within the first 1.25 miles from Rano Raraku, which is the steepest part of the route, where the hillside falls away and controlling the tilt would have been hardest. Their necks are broken, cracked where the head meets the shoulders, the spot most likely to give way when a rocking statue tips past the point of no return. They were never retrieved. Some researchers believe they were left on purpose, to line the road like sentinels. Others think they were simply too heavy to right again. Either way, those fallen statues are physical proof of the method and its risks. And then there were the hats. The pukao, those red cylinders that sit on top of some moai, were carved from a different stone at a different quarry. Red scoria, a rough, reddish volcanic stone, from Punapau on the opposite side of the island. Some weigh up to 12 tons.
They were rolled to the Ahu and then raised up stone ramps onto statues that were already standing. A separate feat of engineering with its own problems and solutions, and one that tells us these builders planned their work in stages. First the body and the journey, then the crown. So the method is clear now, clearer than it's ever been. Carved in the quarry, walked to the coast, raised onto platforms, fitted with red stone hats. We know how. The question that remains is why? What drove a small island society to spend centuries on this work, and what made them one day stop building and start tearing it all down? We know the quarry. We know the road. We know how the statues walked. But none of that tells us why. Why spend generations carving and raising stone figures? What did the Moai mean to the people who built them? The answer starts underneath the platforms. The stone bases that hold the Moai are called Ahu. More than 300 of them ring the island's coastline, spaced along the shore like the beads of a broken necklace. From a distance, they look like retaining walls, big slabs of fitted stone holding up one or more statues. But dig beneath an Ahu, and you find something that changes how you see the whole structure. You find human remains. Bones wrapped in bark cloth, placed in stone-lined chambers inside the platform. Ahu are tombs. The Moai that stand on top of them are portraits of the dead, specific ancestors from specific families raised above the living to keep watch. Each of the island's roughly 12 clans built and maintained its own Ahu. The bigger and more powerful the clan, the bigger the statue it could afford to carve, walk to the coast, and raise. A large Moai announced to every neighbor on the island, "We have the people and the food to move mountains, and we do it for our dead." And those Ahu weren't placed randomly. In 2019, a team led by Robert DiNapoli published a study that mapped every known Ahu location against something you might not expect: fresh water. Remember, this island has no rivers and no surface streams. Rain soaks into the porous volcanic rock and seeps downward, and it only reaches the surface again at certain points along the coast, where the rock meets the sea. Those coastal seeps are the island's most precious resource, and DiNapoli's team found that the locations of the Ahu line up with them. The platforms were built where the water comes out of the ground. The Moai are standing on the sources of life. The size of an Ahu and the number of statues on it may have been a signal. This clan controls this much fresh water. A coastal Ahu with a towering Moai on top is both a gravestone and a water claim, visible from miles away. And the statues face inland toward the villages. We mentioned this early on, and now the reason becomes clear. The Moai are projecting something outward toward the people. The Rapanui called that force mana, a spiritual energy that flowed from the ancestors through the statues and into the community. A Moai, with its back to the ocean and its face to the village, is channeling the power of the dead toward the living, protecting them, strengthening them. But this only worked if the statue could see. And this is where the story loops back to where we started. The eye sockets of a Moai were carved hollow, but they stayed empty during the entire journey from the quarry to the coast. The statue arrived at the Ahu blind, just a stone figure with no life in it. Only after the Moai was raised onto its platform did the final ceremony happen. A carved piece of white coral shaped like an eye, with a pupil of black obsidian or red scoria,
was placed into the socket. The Rapanui called this moment the awakening. The statue became an Aringa Ora, a living face. Mana began to flow. The ancestor could see, and the ancestor was home. Without the eyes, the statue was just rock, dead weight. The ceremony of the eyes was what turned stone into spirit, and it could only happen at the Ahu, with the body of the ancestor buried below and the village waiting in front. The entire system, quarry and road and platform and coral eye, was built around that one moment. So what you're looking at when you see a row of Moai on a coastal platform isn't decoration. It's a machine, a spiritual machine designed to connect the dead to the living, powered by the act of seeing, positioned over the fresh water that kept the clan alive. Every part of it cost something. Labor for the carving, food for the workers, bark rope for the walking, stone for the platform, coral for the eyes. Estimates suggest that moving a single large Moai required dozens of people working for weeks, and all of those people had to be fed from the clan's own harvest. While your best workers were hauling stone, they weren't fishing or farming. Building and maintaining an Ahu was the single biggest investment a clan could make, and the clans competed. That's the part of the story that feels most familiar to us, because we've seen it before. Think of the cathedrals of medieval Europe. Every city wanted a taller spire than the city next door. The competition ran for centuries, and it consumed enormous wealth. On Rapanui, the same dynamic played out in stone. Each clan wanted a taller Moai on a bigger Ahu than the neighbors had. Paro, the tallest statue ever erected at nearly 33 feet and 75 tons, stands at the peak of that race. It was the biggest thing anyone had ever moved and raised. For the clan that built it, Paro was proof that no one on the island could match them. But what happens when a competition like this meets a shrinking resource base? The trees were disappearing, and without trees, there was no bark for rope, and without rope, the statues couldn't walk. The fishing grounds offshore, reachable only by boat, were slipping out of reach too, and the protein supply shrank. Feeding the workers who carved and moved the Moai became harder with each generation. And yet, the building continued. The statues got bigger, not smaller. The ambition grew even as the means to support it dwindled. This is the paradox that has fascinated historians for decades. The most famous version of the question comes from a line that's been attributed to various writers. What was the person who cut down the last palm tree thinking? And the answer, most likely, is something ordinary. They needed firewood or building material, and they cut the tree in front of them because they needed it today. Nobody stands back and says, "I am now felling the last tree on the island." The forest disappears, one decision at a time. Jared Diamond's book, Collapse, published in 2005, turned this question into one of the most widely taught examples of environmental decline in American universities. His chapter on Easter Island became a set reading in environmental science courses from Berkeley to Boston, and the image of the last tree entered public debate, cited by politicians and college students alike as proof that societies can and do destroy themselves. What Diamond described was a clear, tragic arc. A people who wrecked their own environment and paid for it with collapse. Whether that story is fully accurate is a question we'll come back to. Lipo and Hunt have argued that the truth is more complicated, that the Rapanui adapted rather than collapsed, and that the real catastrophe came from the outside, from European contact. The debate is still open, and it matters. But whatever the final answer is, one thing did happen. At some point, the building stopped. The quarry went quiet. And then the statues began to fall. Somebody pushed them off their platforms, face down into the dirt. And somebody ripped out their eyes.
Roggeveen came in 1722 and saw statues standing. Cook came in 1774 and saw many of them lying in the dirt. 52 years between those visits, and in that window, something broke. Or maybe it had been breaking for longer, and those 52 years were just when the damage became impossible to hide. Some early researchers suggested earthquakes. The island sits in an area where earthquakes happen, and a strong tremor could, in theory, shake statues from their platforms. But the evidence doesn't support it. There are no geological traces of a major quake in the right time period, and no local oral memory of the ground shaking. More importantly, the statues didn't fall in random directions the way they would if the earth had knocked them loose. They were tipped forward, face down, deliberately. The platforms they stood on show marks of damage that looks intentional. Pukao were knocked off and stones were pried apart. The damage was systematic. Somebody brought these statues down on purpose. And to understand who, we need to look at a conflict that the Rapanui themselves remembered. The oral tradition tells of two groups on the island, the Hanau Epe and the Hanau Momoko. For a long time, those names were translated as long ears and short ears, which made them sound like two different races. More recent scholarship favors a different reading, stocky and slender, probably two social castes or rival clans rather than two separate peoples. Whatever the distinction was, the tradition says it ended in conflict. The legend centers on a feature called the Poike Ditch, a long trench cut across the eastern peninsula of the island. According to the story, the Hanau Epe filled the ditch with firewood and planned to trap their enemies in it. But the Hanau Momoko found out, circled around, and drove the Hanau Epe into their own trap. The fire was lit. The losers burned. That's the legend, and it's vivid. But when the archaeologist Carlisle Smith excavated the Poike Ditch in 1961, he found plenty of charcoal, layers of it, enough to confirm that large fires had burned there. What he didn't find was a single human bone. Not one. Whatever happened at the Poike Ditch, it wasn't a mass burning of people. The story appears to be a mythologized version of a real conflict, reshaped in memory into something more dramatic and more final than the evidence allows. But that doesn't mean the conflict itself is a myth. Evidence of fighting across the island is real. Analysis by the physical anthropologist Douglas Owsley and his colleagues found widespread cranial trauma in skeletal remains from this period, the kind of injuries caused by blows to the head. Obsidian mata'a, sharp pointed flakes of volcanic glass, have been found scattered across the island in enormous numbers. Whether these were weapons or tools is debated, but the head injuries are not. So there was conflict. Perhaps not a single dramatic war, but a period of escalating tension between clans, driven by shrinking resources and the collapse of the social order that had held the island together
during the centuries of building. And when that tension boiled over, the destruction didn't target people alone. It targeted the statues. What followed is known as the Huri Moai, that is, the era of toppling. Clan by clan, platform by platform, statues were pulled from their ahu and thrown forward onto their faces. The method was efficient. Tip the statue so it falls face down, and the neck snaps on impact because the joint between the head and the torso is the thinnest point of the whole figure. The pukao, those heavy red cylinders on top, came crashing off, and the eyes were torn out. This is the part of the story that everything else has been building toward. Remember the ceremony. A Moai arrives at its ahu blind, empty-socketed, lifeless. The white coral eye is carved, the obsidian pupil set in place, and the statue wakes up. It becomes a living face, an aringa ora, and through its gaze, mana flows outward into the village. The ancestor sees his descendants. The ancestor protects them. Now reverse it. If your enemy's strength comes from his ancestor's gaze, then the way to break that strength is to put out the eyes. Blind the ancestor, and you sever the flow of mana. The statue goes dark. It can no longer see or protect. You haven't just knocked over a piece of stone. You've ended a life that had lasted for generations. The shards of coral that Sergio Rapuhawa found scattered at the base of the Ahu in 1979, those weren't accidental debris. They were the remains of eyes, smashed on purpose, crushed against the rocks. The sockets you see on the Moai today are wounds. Every empty-eyed Moai on the island is a statue that was once alive and then put to rest, deliberately, by the people who lived next door. When the Moai fell silent, something had to take their place. The system of ancestor worship that had organized life on Rapanui for centuries was finished. The statues were dead. The mana was gone. And into that vacuum came something entirely different. The Rapanui call it Tangata Manu, the Birdman coat. Every spring at the ceremonial village of Orongo, perched on the rim of the Rano Raraku volcano, a competition took place. The cliffs at Orongo drop roughly 1,000 feet straight down to the ocean. About 1.25 miles offshore sits a small rocky islet called Motu Nui. Each year, representatives chosen by the island's chiefs would climb down the cliff face, swim through open water to Motu Nui, and wait on the rock for weeks or even months until the sooty tern arrived to nest. The first man to find an egg would strap it to his forehead, swim back, climb the cliff, and present it to his sponsor. According to tradition, the winner shouted to shore, "Shave your head! You've got the egg!" The sponsor of the winning swimmer became the Tangata Manu, the sacred Birdman, for 1 year. He lived apart in a cave, and during that year, he held a status that was something between a king and a holy man. The cult lasted until roughly 1866 or 1867, when missionaries put an end to it. Think about what this shift represents. For centuries, power on the island was expressed through monuments. The bigger your statue, the stronger your clan. It required organization, labor, resources, decades of planning. And then that entire system collapsed, and power passed to something that depended on the body of one man and one swim to a rocky islet. from stone to feather, from dynasty to yearly gamble. Nothing like this transition from monumental construction to individual physical trial has been documented anywhere else. We don't know the precise trigger. Ecological decline, conflict over water, population pressure, decades of war between clans. Probably all of these fed into each other, the way a handful of small fires can merge into one. What we do know is the sequence: building, crisis, conflict, toppling, and then reinvention. The Rapanui didn't simply collapse and disappear. They tore down one world and built another, smaller and stranger, on top of its ruins. But the worst was still coming, and it wouldn't come from inside the island. Easter Island is often told as a warning, a parable about a people too foolish to save themselves, who chopped down every tree and doomed their own civilization. It's a neat story. It's also not quite true. The people who built this place weren't foolish. They taught stone to walk. They may have invented writing. They crossed 2,000 miles of open ocean in wooden canoes, guided by nothing but the stars. And they were trapped by their own success on 63 square miles of rock, surrounded by the largest ocean on Earth, with no neighbor to turn to when things went wrong. So was it suicide or survival? That question has split researchers for 20 years, and the argument still isn't settled. On one side, Jared Diamond, whose book Collapse, published in 2005, made Easter Island the defining example of what happens when a society destroys its own environment. Diamond's case is straightforward. The Rapanui cut the forest, lost their boats, lost their food supply, turned on each other, and collapsed. The book became a bestseller and a set reading in environmental studies courses across the country. For a whole generation of students and policymakers, Easter Island was the proof that civilizations can wreck themselves through sheer environmental recklessness. On the other side, Carl Lipo and Terry Hunt, both professors at American universities, who published The Statues That Walked in 2011. Their argument is different. Yes, the forest disappeared, but the Rapanui adapted. They developed rock gardens, a clever farming technique that used broken stone to retain moisture and nutrients in the soil. The population, Lipo and Hunt argue, didn't crash before Europeans arrived. The island's ecology changed, the society changed with it, but it survived. The real catastrophe, they say, came from the outside. And the debate between these two positions, Diamond's collapse narrative versus Lipo and Hunt's adaptation story, has played out almost entirely in American academia and American popular science, turning a Pacific island into a mirror for our own arguments about climate, consumption, and whether human societies can change course before it's too late. The truth, as usual, sits somewhere between the two. The forest did vanish, and that loss had consequences. But the Rapanui didn't sit still and wait to starve. They adjusted. They found new ways to grow food. The internal conflict was real, and the statues did come down. But the society was still functioning, still adapting when the first European ships appeared on the horizon. And then came the thing that no adaptation could have prepared them for. We talked about the Peruvian slave raids earlier, and the numbers are worth hearing again, because they are the real ending of this story. 1,500 people taken, 15 returned. Smallpox. By 1877, 111 Rapanui left alive on the island. 111. The keepers of the Rongorongo script, the chanters, the elders who understood the ceremonies and could have read the tablets and explained the toppling, all gone in the space of 15 years. The end of Rapanui civilization wasn't caused by statues or by trees. It was caused by ships from across the ocean, carrying men who looked at an island of people and calculated what that labor was worth. And this brings us back to the question that is echoed through the whole story. What was the person who cut down the last palm tree thinking? We asked that earlier. It's a good question, and the answer is probably ordinary. They were cold, or they needed material, and they did what people do. They solved today's problem with what was in front of them. But there's a second question, and it deserves the same weight. What were the men on those Peruvian ships thinking when they loaded families into the hold? They knew what they were doing. They could count the cost, and they did it anyway, because someone would pay for the labor.
You can hold both questions at the same time. One is about the slow damage a society does to itself, one decision at a time, without ever seeing the whole picture. The other is about the sudden damage that comes from outside, deliberate and clear-eyed. Rapanui lived through both. And we might too. Not on 63 square miles, but on a planet that, from the right distance, looks very much like an island. Limited resources and a growing population with no second planet to sail to when the forests thin out and the water gets scarce. The scale is different. The isolation is the same. But the story doesn't end the way you'd expect. Today, roughly 8,000 people live on Rapanui, and the language is still spoken. Children are learning the old dances and the old chants, even if nobody yet can read what's written on the 27 surviving Rongorongo tablets. If that script turns out to be true writing, and nobody's proven that yet, then cracking it would rank among the great discoveries in the history of language. In 2025, a researcher named Eric Kiley claimed to have fully deciphered it, but the scholarly community remains skeptical. The mystery is still open. And the Moai are coming back. Gradually, statue by statue, the Rapanui are restoring the platforms. At Ahu Ko Te Riku on the western coast, one Moai stands with its eyes in place again. White coral, dark pupil, staring inland. The wind comes off the ocean behind it and passes through the grass. The village is quiet, and the statue is watching, the way it watched 500 years ago, when the palms were still standing and the canoes still sailed. It can see again, and it isn't looking at the ocean. Thank you for staying until the end. I genuinely appreciate every one of you who listened. If this documentary gave you something, a fact you didn't know, a question you hadn't thought of, a like and a subscribe would mean a lot. It's the simplest way to support this kind of work. One last question. The Rapanui tore down their own statues and ripped out the coral eyes. But today, one Moai at Ahu Ko Te Riku has its eyes back in. It can see again. If you could restore one lost monument from any civilization in history, which one would you bring back? Drop your answer in the comments.